Hey guys, welcome to my detailed series on the Pala Empire, the ancient Indian Buddhist empire. In this journey, we will explore one of the most fascinating yet often overlooked dynasties in Indian history, tracing its rise, rule, culture, philosophy, and lasting influence across South Asia and beyond. The Pala Empire, which emerged in the eastern regions of India during the 8th century CE, became a major center of political power, religious scholarship, and artistic innovation, shaping the intellectual and cultural contours of its time. Known for its support of Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism, the dynasty established renowned centers of learning, such as Nalanda and Vikramashila, attracting scholars from across Asia and fostering an environment of debate, research, and spiritual inquiry that left a profound imprint on Buddhist traditions in Tibet, Nepal, and Southeast Asia. Beyond religion and learning, the Palas were also remarkable rulers, administrators, and patrons of art, architecture, and trade, creating a civilization where governance, economic prosperity, and cultural patronage were deeply intertwined. Throughout this series, we will examine not only the chronology of kings and battles, but also the subtle ways in which the Pala Empire shaped society, ideas, and everyday life, offering lessons in pluralism, ethical leadership, and intellectual resilience. By following the story of the Palas from their origins to their enduring legacy, we will uncover how an empire devoted to knowledge, ethical governance, and cultural synthesis can influence human thought and civilization long after its political power has faded. This series is not just history. It's an exploration of a worldview that emphasizes the cultivation of mind and society, showing us that the greatest legacy of any empire may lie not in its conquests, but in the ideas and values it leaves behind. The Pala Empire emerged as one of the most significant political, cultural, and religious powers in early medieval South Asia, marking a decisive chapter in the history of the Indian subcontinent through its patronage of Buddhism, administrative stability, and far-reaching intellectual influence. Rising in the aftermath of political fragmentation that followed the decline of the Gupta Empire, the Palas established control over vast regions of eastern India, particularly Bengal and Bihar, during a period often characterized by instability and regional conflict. The very foundation of the Pala state reflects a unique historical moment, as the dynasty's first ruler, Gopala, is traditionally said to have been elected by regional chieftains around the mid-8th century CE to end a prolonged era of chaos and lawlessness known in later sources as Matsyaniya, or the Law of the Fishes, where the strong preyed upon the weak. This semi-elective origin, whether literal or symbolic, underscores the Palas' role as restorers of order and highlights the social conditions that enabled their rise. Gopala's consolidation of power in Bengal laid the groundwork for a dynasty that would endure for nearly 4 centuries, a remarkable feat in an era marked by frequent dynastic turnover. His successors transformed this regional authority into an imperial structure that extended from the Gangetic Plains to parts of present-day Assam, Odisha, and even influenced regions beyond the Indian subcontinent. The Pala rulers were not merely military conquerors. They were architects of a distinctive political culture that combined pragmatic governance with ideological legitimacy drawn from religion, especially Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism. The reign of Dharmapala, Gopala's son, marked a decisive expansion of Pala power and ambition. Dharmapala envisioned a pan-North Indian empire and actively intervened in the political struggles of the Gangetic heartland, challenging rival dynasties such as the Pratiharas and the Rashtrakutas in what historians later termed the tripartite struggle for control of Kannauj, the symbolic seat of imperial authority. Although Dharmapala did not achieve lasting control over Kannauj, his military campaigns demonstrated the Palas' imperial aspirations and positioned them as one of the 3 great powers of early medieval India. More importantly, Dharmapala's reign cemented the dynasty's enduring association with Buddhism. He emerged as a major patron of monastic institutions and is credited with founding or revitalizing renowned centers of learning, such as Vikramashila, which would later rival Nalanda in prestige. These institutions were not only religious centers, but also hubs of philosophy, logic, medicine, astronomy, and the arts, attracting scholars from across Asia. Under Dharmapala, the Pala state developed an ideology that portrayed the king as a righteous protector of the Dharma, aligning royal authority with moral and spiritual responsibility. This ideological framework was further refined under Divapala, one of the most powerful and successful Pala rulers, whose reign represented the zenith of Pala territorial expansion and international influence. Divapala's inscriptions boast of campaigns that reached as far as the northwestern frontiers of India and extended Pala influence deep into the Deccan and northeastern regions. While such claims must be read with caution, there is little doubt that Divapala commanded immense prestige and military strength. His court maintained diplomatic and religious contacts with the Buddhist world beyond India, including Southeast Asia and the Tibetan Plateau. One of the most striking examples of the Palas' transregional influence is their relationship with the Srivijaya Empire of Southeast Asia, whose rulers sought Divapala's permission and support to establish a monastery at Nalanda for monks from their realm. This exchange illustrates how the Pala Empire functioned as a central node in a vast network of Buddhist scholarship and pilgrimage that connected India with regions as distant as Sumatra, Java, and China. The prosperity and stability of the Pala heartland enabled the flourishing of a distinctive artistic tradition known today as Pala art, characterized by refined stone and bronze sculptures depicting Buddhist deities, bodhisattvas, and occasionally Hindu figures. These artworks reflect a sophisticated synthesis of spiritual symbolism and aesthetic elegance, emphasizing serenity, balanced proportions, and intricate iconography. The Palas' religious policy, while strongly favoring Buddhism, was notably inclusive. Many Pala rulers also patronized Hindu temples, Brahmanical scholars, and Saiva and Vaishnava institutions, recognizing the pluralistic nature of their subjects' beliefs. This pragmatic tolerance contributed to social stability and facilitated the integration of diverse communities within the empire. Administratively, the Pala state combined inherited traditions from earlier Indian polities with innovations suited to regional conditions. The empire was divided into provinces governed by officials who oversaw revenue collection, law and order, and military organization. Land grants, often recorded on copper plates, played a crucial role in the economic and administrative system, rewarding officials, religious institutions, and allies while extending state authority into rural areas. These grants provide invaluable insights into the social structure of Pala society, revealing a complex hierarchy that included peasants, artisans, merchants, monks, and landed elites. The agrarian economy formed the backbone of the empire, supported by fertile river valleys and extensive irrigation networks, while trade along riverine and maritime routes connected Bengal to wider commercial circuits in the Indian Ocean world. Despite their achievements, the Palas were not immune to internal challenges and external pressures. After the death of Divapala, the empire experienced periods of decline and resurgence, reflecting the difficulties of maintaining centralized authority over vast territories. Succession disputes, regional rebellions, and renewed conflicts with rival dynasties gradually eroded Pala power. Nevertheless, rulers such as Mahapala I in the late 10th and early 11th centuries managed to revive the dynasty's fortunes, restoring control over core territories and reaffirming royal patronage of Buddhism and learning. Mahapala's reign is often seen as a Renaissance period, marked by the rebuilding of monasteries and the reassertion of political authority after a phase of decline. However, the broader historical context was changing. The rise of new regional powers, the increasing militarization of politics, and the gradual shift in religious patronage patterns posed significant challenges to the Pala state. By the 12th century, the Palas faced mounting pressure from emerging Hindu dynasties such as the Senas, who would eventually replace them in Bengal. The final Pala rulers struggled to maintain their authority in the face of shrinking resources and diminishing support, and the dynasty ultimately faded from power, bringing an end to one of the most influential Buddhist polities in Indian history. Yet the legacy of the Pala Empire far outlasted its political demise. Through their sustained patronage of Buddhist institutions, the Palas played a decisive role in shaping the intellectual and spiritual landscape of Asia. Scholars trained in Pala monasteries carried Indian Buddhist philosophy, logic, and ritual practices to Tibet, where they profoundly influenced the development of Tibetan Buddhism. Texts translated under Pala patronage became foundational to Buddhist scholastic traditions across Asia, ensuring that the intellectual achievements of this period continued to resonate long after Buddhism declined in India itself. The artistic styles developed under the Palas also spread beyond the subcontinent, leaving a lasting imprint on the visual culture of Nepal, Tibet, and Southeast Asia. In historical memory, the Pala Empire stands as a testament to the enduring power of ideas and institutions. It represents a period when political authority was closely intertwined with intellectual and spiritual pursuits, when kings saw themselves as guardians of learning and faith, as well as rulers of territory. The Palas' ability to foster stability, encourage cultural exchange, and sustain a vibrant tradition of scholarship amid a complex and often turbulent political environment marks them as one of the great dynasties of early medieval India. Part 1 of the Pala Empire story thus reveals not only the rise of a powerful state, but also the foundations of a civilizational legacy that would shape the history of Buddhism in South Asia for centuries to come. The second phase of the Pala Empire's history reveals a complex interplay of revival, resilience, cultural continuity, and gradual transformation, illustrating how a once-dominant Buddhist imperial power adapted to changing political, social, and religious realities in early medieval India. Following the expansive reigns of Dharmapala and Divapala, the empire entered a period often described by historians as one of contraction rather than sudden collapse, where authority weakened unevenly across regions, but core institutions and cultural traditions endured. The post-Divapala era was marked by succession struggles and increasing autonomy among provincial governors, many of whom had been empowered during earlier expansions and now sought greater independence. This decentralization reflected a broader trend in early medieval Indian polity, where land grants and feudal-like relationships strengthened local elites at the expense of centralized control. Yet, despite these challenges, the Pala state retained a remarkable capacity for recovery, rooted in its administrative experience, economic resources, and ideological legitimacy as a protector of Dharma. The reign of Mahapala I stands as a defining moment in this phase, often characterized as a restoration rather than a renaissance, for it sought to reclaim the political and moral authority that had eroded in previous decades. Mahapala successfully reasserted control over Bengal and parts of Bihar, rebuilt damaged monasteries, and revived royal patronage of Buddhist institutions, reaffirming the Palas' traditional role as guardians of monastic learning. His efforts were not merely symbolic. They reflected a strategic understanding that religious institutions remained crucial centers of economic activity, social cohesion, and ideological support. Monasteries owned land, employed laborers, educated elites, and served as hubs of cultural transmission, making them indispensable allies for any ruler seeking legitimacy and stability. Under Mahapala and his successors, the Palas continued to maintain close ties with major monastic universities such as Nalanda, Vikramashila, Odintapuri, and Samapura, which together formed an interconnected network of learning unparalleled in the contemporary world. These institutions attracted students from across Asia, including Tibet, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia, reinforcing Eastern India's status as the heartland of late Indian Buddhism. The intellectual output of this period was extraordinary, marked by advances in logic, epistemology, metaphysics, and tantric ritual. Scholars such as Atisha Dipankara Srinana, who was trained in Pala monasteries before traveling to Tibet, exemplify the transregional influence of Pala-supported scholarship. Atisha's role in reforming Tibetan Buddhism highlights how the Palas' cultural legacy extended far beyond their political borders, shaping religious developments in regions where Buddhism would continue to flourish long after its decline in India. The Pala rulers, engagement with Vajrayana Buddhism during this later phase further distinguished their religious policy, as tantric practices, esoteric rituals, and complex iconography became increasingly prominent in monastic life and artistic production. Far from representing decadence or decline, this turn toward Vajrayana reflected Buddhism's dynamic adaptability and its capacity to integrate local beliefs, ritual practices, and symbolic systems. Pala art from this period displays an extraordinary sophistication, with bronze and stone sculptures depicting a vast pantheon of Buddhas, bodhisattvas, and tantric deities rendered with refined craftsmanship and spiritual intensity. These artistic forms were not confined to elite religious contexts. They circulated through trade networks and pilgrimage routes, influencing visual cultures across the Himalayan region and Southeast Asia. Economically, the later Pala Empire continued to benefit from Bengal's fertile landscape and strategic position within regional and international trade networks. Riverine commerce along the Ganges and its tributaries facilitated the movement of agricultural surplus, textiles, and luxury goods, while Bengal's ports connected the empire to the Indian Ocean world. Merchants played a vital role in sustaining urban centers and supporting religious institutions through donations and endowments, creating a symbiotic relationship between commerce and spirituality. The persistence of long-distance trade under the Palas challenges simplistic narratives of early medieval economic stagnation, and instead points to a diversified and resilient economy capable of adapting to political change. However, the Palas' later centuries were also shaped by intensifying competition with emerging regional powers, particularly the Sena dynasty, which gradually gained influence in Bengal. The Senas, adherents of Brahmanical Hinduism, represented a shift in religious patronage patterns, favoring Sanskritic learning, temple construction, and caste-based social organization. This transition did not occur abruptly, but unfolded over generations, as Hindu institutions increasingly received royal support, while Buddhist monasteries faced declining patronage and vulnerability to political upheaval. The Palas' continued support for Buddhism in this context reflects both ideological commitment and strategic calculation, yet it also underscores the growing challenges they faced in maintaining dominance within a changing cultural landscape. External pressures further compounded these difficulties, as renewed conflicts with neighboring polities strained resources and exposed the limits of imperial authority. Despite these challenges, the Palas did not disappear quietly. They continued to rule parts of eastern India into the 12th century, adapting their governance to a more regionalized political order. Later rulers maintained alliances with local elites, issued land grants to secure loyalty, and upheld traditional symbols of kingship, demonstrating a pragmatic approach to survival. Yet the cumulative effects of territorial loss, economic strain, and shifting religious preferences ultimately weakened the dynasty's foundations. The final phase of Pala rule coincided with broader transformations in South Asian history, including the gradual decline of institutional Buddhism in India and the reconfiguration of political power around new dynastic centers. When the Senas eventually supplanted the Palas in Bengal, they inherited not an empty landscape, but a region deeply shaped by centuries of Pala governance, culture, and intellectual life. The decline of the Pala Empire did not signify the end of its influence. Rather, it marked a transition in which its cultural and religious contributions continued to resonate beyond the boundaries of political authority. Buddhist texts composed and preserved under Pala patronage survived in Tibetan and other Asian translations, ensuring that the philosophical debates and ritual traditions of this period remained accessible to future generations. Artistic styles developed in Pala workshops continued to inspire sculptors and painters across Asia, embedding the empire's aesthetic legacy in diverse cultural contexts. Even as Buddhism waned in its Indian homeland, the Pala Empire's role as a conduit of ideas, art, and spirituality ensured its enduring presence in the historical memory of Asia. Part 2 of the Pala Empire story thus reveals a narrative not of simple decline, but of adaptation, continuity, and transformation, where political power ebbed even as cultural influence expanded. It underscores the resilience of institutions, the mobility of ideas, and the capacity of a civilization to leave a lasting imprint beyond the lifespan of its rulers. Through its later history, the Pala Empire stands as a powerful reminder that the true measure of an empire lies not only in its territorial reach, but in the depth and durability of the values, knowledge, and artistic traditions it nurtures. The final phase of the Pala Empire's story invites a deeper reflection on legacy, historical memory, and the long-term consequences of a civilization that shaped the spiritual and intellectual contours of Asia, even as it faded from political prominence in India. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the Palas governed a much-reduced territory, yet their ideological vision and cultural institutions continued to exert influence far beyond their immediate control. This period must be understood not merely as an epilogue of decline, but as a moment of profound transition in South Asian history, when older imperial models gave way to new regional configurations and religious priorities. The later Pala rulers operated in an environment marked by intensified regionalism, shifting economic centers, and the steady ascendancy of Brahmanical Hindu dynasties, such as the Senas in Bengal and the Gahadavalas in the Gangetic Plain. These political shifts reflected deeper social changes, including the growing importance of caste-based agrarian structures, temple-centered religious life, and Sanskritic court culture. Within this context, the Palas' continued patronage of Buddhism appears both remarkable and poignant, representing one of the last sustained efforts by an Indian dynasty to uphold large-scale monastic institutions and transregional Buddhist scholarship. Even as their political authority narrowed, the Palas remained symbolically powerful as protectors of the Dharma, and this moral authority sustained the prestige of Buddhist centers that had flourished for centuries under their rule. Nalanda, Vikramashila, Odintapuri, and Samapura continued to function as hubs of learning well into the 12th century, drawing monks, scholars, and pilgrims from across Asia. These institutions embodied a cosmopolitan intellectual culture in which debate, commentary, translation, and ritual practice coexisted, producing a body of knowledge that would outlive the empire itself. The destruction and abandonment of many of these monasteries in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, often associated with political upheavals and invasions, marked not only the end of Pala patronage, but also a decisive rupture in the institutional history of Indian Buddhism. Yet this rupture did not erase the intellectual achievements of the Pala period. Instead, it redirected them outward, as texts, teachers, and traditions preserved a broad ensured continuity in new cultural settings. The Tibetan plateau, in particular, emerged as the principal heir to the Pala Buddhist legacy, absorbing its philosophical systems, ritual technologies, and artistic conventions with remarkable fidelity. Tibetan historians later looked back to the Pala era as a golden age of authentic Indian Buddhism, venerating Indian scholars and monasteries as sources of doctrinal purity and spiritual authority. This retrospective reverence underscores the paradox of the Pala Empire's final centuries. Political decline coincided with the crystallization of a legacy that would define Buddhist thought outside India for generations. The transmission of Pala Buddhism was not limited to philosophy and ritual. It also encompassed administrative practices, monastic organization, and pedagogical methods, many of which were adapted to local contexts while retaining their Mool, Indian foundations. Art and architecture provide another lens through which the later Pala legacy can be understood. Even in their final phase, Pala workshops produced sculptures of exceptional refinement, characterized by fluid lines, subtle expressions, and dense symbolic detail. These works reveal a mature artistic vocabulary shaped by centuries of experimentation and spiritual reflection. The diffusion of this style across Nepal, Tibet, and Southeast Asia ensured that Pala aesthetics became embedded in the visual language of Himalayan and trans-Himalayan Buddhism. In this sense, the decline of Pala political power did not diminish the vitality of Pala culture. Instead, it facilitated its transformation into a transregional tradition no longer bound to a single dynasty or territory. Economically and socially, The end of the Pala Empire also reshaped eastern India in enduring ways. The agrarian infrastructure, land-holding patterns, and urban networks developed under Pala rule continued to structure regional economies long after the dynasty's fall. The rise of the Senas built upon these foundations, even as it reoriented patronage toward Hindu temples and Brahmanical institutions. This continuity amid change highlights the Palas' role as bridge builders between ancient imperial systems and medieval regional polities. Their governance practices, though increasingly constrained in the later period, contributed to a political culture that valued institutional continuity, negotiated authority, and religious legitimacy. From a broader historical perspective, the Pala Empire's final phase challenges linear narratives of rise and fall by illustrating how cultural influence can persist and even expand as political structures weaken. The Palas did not simply vanish from history. They were absorbed into it, their achievements refracted through the traditions they helped sustain. The disappearance of Buddhism from much of India after the 12th century has often been interpreted as evidence of failure or displacement. Yet the Pala case suggests a more nuanced reality in which religious traditions migrate, adapt, and endure beyond their original contexts. The intellectual energy invested in Buddhist philosophy under the Palas did not dissipate. It found new homes, new languages, and new audiences, ensuring that the core ideas of compassion, emptiness, and enlightenment continued to inspire practitioners across Asia. In historical memory, the Palas occupy a distinctive position as the last great patrons of Indian Buddhism, a role that imbues their story with both grandeur and melancholy. Their empire represents a moment when political authority, spiritual aspiration, and scholarly endeavor were deeply intertwined, producing a civilization whose impact cannot be measured solely by territorial extent or military success. Instead, the true significance of the Pala Empire lies in its capacity to nurture institutions and ideas that transcended the contingencies of power. Part 3 of the Pala Empire narrative thus brings the series to a contemplative close, emphasizing legacy over loss and continuity over collapse. It invites us to see the Palas not as relics of a vanished world, but as architects of a cultural and intellectual tradition that reshaped Asia and enriched human history. Through their final struggles and enduring contributions, the Palas remind us that empires may fall, but the ideas they cultivate can travel far beyond the limits of time and space, carrying forward the essence of a civilization long after its political structures have faded into the past. Part 4 of the Pala Empire narrative turns inward to examine the deeper social fabric, intellectual atmosphere, and historical interpretation of this remarkable Buddhist polity, offering a holistic understanding of how the Palas shaped everyday life, knowledge systems, and long-term historical consciousness in eastern India and beyond. Beneath the grand narratives of kings, monasteries, and diplomacy lay a complex society in which agrarian communities, artisans, merchants, monks, and local elites interacted within a framework shaped by state policy, religious patronage, and regional ecology. The Pala heartland of Bengal and Bihar was defined by fertile river plains, dense networks of waterways, and monsoon-driven agriculture, conditions that supported surplus production and sustained large populations. Peasant communities formed the backbone of the economy, cultivating rice, pulses, and other crops that not only fed urban centers and monasteries, but also generated the revenue necessary for imperial administration. Land grants issued by Pala rulers, often to religious institutions and Brahmanical beneficiaries alike, reshaped rural society by creating zones of privilege and authority that linked local production to imperial ideology. These grants did not merely transfer land, they transferred rights over labor, taxation, and judicial authority, embedding religious institutions deeply into the social and economic life of the countryside. Buddhist monasteries under the Palas were thus not isolated spiritual enclaves, but active participants in regional economies, employing laborers, managing estates, and redistributing resources through ritual, education, and charity. Urban life under the Palas reflected a similar interweaving of commerce, religion, and culture. Cities and towns along river routes functioned as centers of trade, administration, and intellectual exchange, where merchants from different regions interacted with monks, scholars, and officials. Bengal's integration into Indian Ocean trade networks brought wealth and cultural diversity, as goods, ideas, and people moved between South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Himalayan regions. This commercial vitality supported artisanal production, particularly in metalwork, textiles, and sculpture, contributing to the flourishing of Pala art and material culture. Artisans, though rarely visible in elite textual sources, played a crucial role in translating religious ideals into tangible forms, crafting images that conveyed complex philosophical concepts through posture, gesture, and iconography. The prominence of bronze sculpture during the Pala period reflects both technological sophistication and the demands of devotional practice, as portable images facilitated ritual use and long-distance transmission of religious aesthetics. Education and intellectual life formed another cornerstone of Pala society, distinguished by institutional continuity and cosmopolitan openness. Monastic universities such as Nalanda and Vikramashila operated as structured environments of learning, with curricula, examinations, and scholarly hierarchies that fostered rigorous debate and specialization. Students engaged deeply with logic, grammar, metaphysics, medicine, and ritual theory, producing commentaries and treatises that refined Buddhist thought at a moment when it faced both internal diversification and external competition. The coexistence of Buddhist and Brahmanical scholars within the same regions encouraged intellectual cross-pollination, as debates over metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics sharpened arguments on all sides. Far from existing in isolation, Pala Buddhism evolved in dialogue with Hindu philosophical schools, absorbing methods of reasoning while articulating distinct doctrinal positions. This intellectual dynamism challenges simplistic portrayals of late Indian Buddhism as stagnant or decadent, and instead reveals a tradition actively responding to changing intellectual and social conditions. Gender and social hierarchy within Pala society also merit attention, though the sources remain fragmentary and often mediated through elite perspectives. Women appear in inscriptions and literary references primarily as donors, queens, or symbolic figures, yet their participation in religious patronage suggests avenues of agency within constrained social structures. Queens and royal women occasionally endowed monasteries and temples, reinforcing dynastic legitimacy and spiritual merit. Within monastic communities, the presence of nuns is less clearly documented, reflecting broader gender asymmetries in historical record-keeping. But Buddhist doctrine's emphasis on spiritual potential across social categories continued to offer ideological space for inclusion. At the same time, the increasing prominence of land grants and hereditary privileges during the later Pala period contributed to the consolidation of social stratification, aligning religious authority with economic power in ways that both stabilized and constrained society. From the perspective of governance, the Palas exemplified a model of kingship that balanced ritual legitimacy with pragmatic administration. Kings presented themselves as righteous rulers committed to the welfare of their subjects and the protection of Dharma, yet they also relied on negotiation with local elites, military leaders, and religious institutions to maintain control. This flexible approach allowed the Pala state to endure for centuries despite recurring challenges, but it also limited the capacity for centralized reform, particularly in the later period when regional powers asserted greater autonomy. The gradual shift from imperial ambition to regional survival reflects not failure but adaptation, as the Palas navigated a political landscape increasingly defined by localized authority and shifting religious patronage. Historiographically, the Pala Empire occupies an ambivalent position in Indian history, often overshadowed by earlier classical empires or later Hindu dynasties. Colonial and early nationalist historiography tended to marginalize the Palas, viewing the period through a lens of decline associated with the waning of Buddhism in India. More recent scholarship, however, has reevaluated the Pala era, as one of creative synthesis and global significance, emphasizing its role in sustaining intellectual networks that connected India to the wider Asian world. Archaeological discoveries, art historical analysis, and comparative studies of textual traditions have collectively enriched our understanding of the Palas, revealing a society far more complex and influential than earlier narratives allowed. This reassessment underscores the importance of moving beyond political chronology to consider cultural transmission, institutional resilience, and transregional exchange as measures of historical significance. The Pala Empire's story, thus, speaks not only to the history of India, but to broader questions about how civilizations endure through ideas, institutions, and cultural practices even as political power wanes. By fostering environments in which learning, art, and spirituality could thrive, the Palas created conditions for a legacy that transcended their own historical moment. Part 4 of the Pala Empire series highlights this deeper dimension, showing how everyday life, social organization, and intellectual endeavor formed the foundation upon which imperial ambition and religious patronage rested. In doing so, it completes a portrait of the Pala Empire as a living civilization rather than a static political entity, a society whose influence radiated outward through the minds it shaped, the images it crafted, and the values it upheld. The Palas remind us that history's most enduring contributions often emerge not from conquest alone, but from sustained commitment to knowledge, cultural dialogue, and the human search for meaning. Part 5 of the Pala Empire series brings the narrative into a broader comparative and civilizational perspective, examining how the Pala state fit within global medieval history, how it interacted with parallel civilizations, and why its experience offers enduring lessons about power, religion, and cultural transmission. By situating the Pala Empire within a wider Eurasian context, this final analytical layer reveals that the Palas were not an isolated Eastern Indian dynasty, but participants in a complex world of interconnected societies, stretching from the Mediterranean to East Asia. During the height of Pala power between the 8th and 11th centuries, much of the world was witnessing the consolidation of regional empires and the flowering of religiously inspired intellectual cultures. In the Islamic world, the Abbasid Caliphate fostered centers of learning in Baghdad, while in East Asia the Tang and Song dynasties oversaw technological innovation and bureaucratic refinement. The Pala Empire occupied a comparable position in South Asia, functioning as a spiritual and scholarly core rather than a purely military hegemon. Its strength lay not only in armies and territory, but in its capacity to sustain institutions that generated knowledge, trained elites, and projected cultural authority across borders. This form of influence, often described as soft power in modern terms, allowed the Palas to shape the religious and intellectual trajectories of vast regions without direct political control. The monasteries of Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Samapura played roles analogous to Baghdad's House of Wisdom or China's imperial academies, serving as nodes in global networks of scholarship, where texts were studied, translated, and debated. The comparison highlights how medieval civilizations, despite geographical distance, shared a common reliance on institutional learning as a source of legitimacy and continuity. The Pala Empire's relationship with Buddhism also invites comparison with the ways other medieval states aligned themselves with universal religions. Just as the Abbasids positioned themselves as protectors of Islam, and the Tang emperors patronized Confucian learning alongside Buddhism and Taoism, the Palas grounded their authority in the guardianship of the Buddhist Dharma. Yet the Pala case is distinctive because Buddhism, unlike Islam or Confucianism, was already beginning to lose political support in its land of origin. The Palas thus represent a rare example of a dynasty that consciously upheld a tradition at a moment when broader social currents were turning away from it. This choice endowed their rule with a sense of moral purpose, but also exposed them to long-term vulnerability as patronage patterns shifted toward Brahmanical Hindu institutions. Even so, the Palas' commitment ensured that Buddhism's intellectual core was preserved and transmitted beyond India, illustrating how state support can decisively shape the survival of religious traditions. The transregional mobility of monks, texts, and artistic styles under the Palas demonstrates that medieval globalization was not limited to trade goods, but extended deeply into the realm of ideas. Tibetan, Nepalese, and Southeast Asian pilgrims traveled to eastern India, not merely to visit sacred sites, but to participate in living intellectual communities. These encounters transformed local traditions, creating hybrid forms of Buddhism that combined Indian philosophical rigor with regional ritual and artistic expressions. The Palas thus functioned as cultural mediators, translating Indian Buddhist heritage into forms that could take root elsewhere. This process mirrors how Greco-Roman knowledge was transmitted through Islamic scholars to medieval Europe, or how Chinese technologies spread across Eurasia, reinforcing the idea that civilizations advance through exchange as much as through innovation. The eventual decline of the Pala Empire also resonates with broader patterns in world history, where shifts in economic structures, religious preferences, and political organization reshape the foundations of power. The rise of temple-centered Hindu polities in eastern India reflects a transformation similar to the decentralization seen in post-Carolingian Europe or the fragmentation of Abbasid authority, where local elites and new institutional forms gradually replaced older imperial systems. In each case, decline did not equate to disappearance, but to transformation, as elements of the old order were absorbed into new frameworks. The Palas, administrative practices, agrarian systems, and cultural norms persisted under their successors, demonstrating how empires often outlive themselves through institutional memory. From a philosophical standpoint, the Pala Empire's history raises profound questions about the relationship between power and knowledge. The Palas invested heavily in institutions that did not directly enhance military strength, yet proved essential to their lasting significance. This prioritization suggests an understanding of rulership rooted in ethical responsibility and intellectual stewardship, rather than domination alone. Such a model contrasts with more conquest-driven empires and challenges modern assumptions about what constitutes historical success. While the Palas ultimately lost political control, they achieved a form of immortality through the traditions they nurtured, reminding us that influence can be measured in centuries of thought as well as decades of rule. In contemporary South Asia, the memory of the Pala Empire remains fragmented but meaningful. Archaeological sites, scattered sculptures, and manuscript traditions testify to a period when Eastern India stood at the center of a global religious and intellectual network. Modern historical scholarship continues to reassess the Palas, recognizing them not as symbols of decline, but as agents of continuity and creativity during a time of transition. This reevaluation has broader implications for how history is written, encouraging scholars to move beyond narratives centered solely on political dominance and to appreciate the quieter, yet more enduring forces of culture and learning. Part 5 of the Pala Empire series thus serves as a concluding meditation on the dynasty's place in world history. It affirms that the Palas were not merely rulers of a region, but custodians of a civilizational legacy that transcended borders and centuries. Their story illustrates how ideas travel farther than armies, how institutions can outlast dynasties, and how the pursuit of knowledge and spiritual meaning can leave traces deeper than conquest. In reflecting on the Pala Empire as a whole, we are reminded that history's most lasting empires are often those that shape the minds and values of humanity, carrying their influence forward long after their banners have fallen and their capitals have faded into memory. Part 6 of the Pala Empire series deepens the narrative by focusing on archaeology, material remains, and the modern rediscovery of the Pala world, revealing how physical evidence complements literary sources to reconstruct the life of a Buddhist empire that once stood at the crossroads of Asian civilization. Long after the political disappearance of the Palas, their landscapes remained imprinted with monasteries, mounds, sculptures, and inscriptions, silently preserving memories of an age when Eastern India was a beacon of learning and spirituality. The archaeological footprint of the Pala Empire is vast and unevenly explored, stretching across present-day Bangladesh, West Bengal, Bihar, and parts of Odisha and Assam. Sites such as Samapura Mahavihara at Paharpur, Nalanda, Vikramashila, Odintapuri, Jagadala, and Mainamati provide tangible testimony to the scale and sophistication of Pala patronage. These were not modest religious establishments, but monumental complexes designed to accommodate thousands of monks, students, teachers, and workers, reflecting both immense state investment and the central role of monastic institutions in imperial life. Samapura Mahavihara, with its vast cruciform structure and terrace design, exemplifies Pala architectural innovation, blending symmetry, ritual symbolism, and functional planning in a form that influenced Buddhist architecture across Asia. The very layout of such monasteries reveals a worldview in which cosmic order, intellectual discipline, and communal living were harmonized through space and structure. Archaeological excavations have uncovered libraries, cells, shrines, workshops, and water systems, illustrating how monasteries functioned as self-sufficient microcosms of the Pala state. Inscriptions and seals recovered from these sites confirm their administrative complexity, recording grants, donors, and monastic officials, and offering rare glimpses into institutional governance. Material culture from the Pala period further enriches our understanding of everyday religious and artistic practice. Sculptures in stone and bronze, often discovered far from their original contexts, attest to the widespread circulation of sacred images and the high level of craftsmanship achieved by Pala artisans. These works are distinguished by their calm spiritual presence, rhythmic lines, and intricate iconography, conveying sophisticated theological ideas through visual form. The prevalence of Vajrayana deities in later Pala art reflects doctrinal developments documented in textual sources, demonstrating the close relationship between philosophy and artistic expression. Terracotta plaques, pottery, beads, and tools recovered from habitation layers reveal aspects of daily life that elite texts rarely address, pointing to patterns of consumption, trade, and technological skill. Together, these artifacts challenge any notion of a culturally impoverished or stagnant society, instead portraying a vibrant world where religious ideals, economic activity, and artistic creativity were deeply intertwined. The study of Pala archaeology also illuminates the empire's integration into wider networks of exchange. Coins, inscriptions, and stylistic parallels show connections with Nepal, Tibet, Southeast Asia, and even distant regions linked through pilgrimage and trade. The diffusion of Pala artistic styles into Nepalese and Tibetan sculpture is particularly striking, as it demonstrates how material forms traveled alongside texts and teachers, shaping regional identities. Archaeological evidence thus reinforces the idea of the Pala Empire as a hub of transregional interaction, where material and intellectual cultures moved together across borders. The decline and abandonment of many Pala sites in the late 12th and 13th centuries mark a dramatic turning point, often associated with political upheaval and the collapse of institutional patronage. Layers of destruction, signs of sudden desertion, and the cessation of building activity speak to a rupture in the continuity of Buddhist life in eastern India. Yet archaeology also shows resilience and adaptation, as some sites were repurposed, reused, or remembered in local traditions long after their original functions ended. The memory of places like Nalanda did not vanish entirely. It survived in Tibetan histories, travel accounts, and later scholarly imagination, awaiting rediscovery by modern archaeology. The colonial and post-colonial rediscovery of the Pala Empire transformed scholarly understanding of early medieval India. 19th and early 20th century excavations, driven by a mix of antiquarian curiosity and academic inquiry, brought Pala sites to global attention and challenged older historical narratives that dismissed the period as one of decline. The recovery of inscriptions and manuscripts allowed historians to reconstruct dynastic sequences, administrative practices, and intellectual lineages with greater precision. At the same time, the dispersal of Pala artifacts into museums around the world raised ethical and interpretive questions about ownership, context, and representation, issues that continue to shape debates in heritage studies today. In South Asia, The material legacy of the Palas plays an important role in cultural identity and historical consciousness, particularly in Bengal and Bangladesh, where sites like Paharpur are recognized as symbols of a shared past that transcends modern national boundaries. The Pala Empire's archaeological remains also invite reflection on the fragility and endurance of civilization. Stone monasteries crumble, bronze images are buried or displaced, and inscriptions erode, yet the ideas embodied in these materials can survive in unexpected ways. The contrast between the physical vulnerability of Pala monuments and the durability of their intellectual legacy highlights a central theme of the empire's history: the tension between impermanence and continuity. Buddhism itself, with its emphasis on transience, found an ironic mirror in the fate of its Indian heartland, even as its teachings endured elsewhere. From a methodological perspective, the integration of archaeology with textual analysis has transformed the study of the Pala Empire, allowing scholars to move beyond dynastic chronicles and doctrinal texts to reconstruct a more holistic picture of society. Material evidence grounds abstract narratives in lived experience, revealing how imperial policies affected local communities and how religious ideals were enacted in physical space. This interdisciplinary approach underscores the importance of viewing the Pala Empire not merely as a sequence of rulers, but as a complex system of relationships among people, places, and ideas. Part 6 thus emphasizes that the story of the Pala Empire continues to unfold through ongoing research and reinterpretation. Each excavation, inscription, and artifact adds nuance to our understanding, reminding us that history is not static, but constantly reshaped by new evidence and perspectives. The Palas emerge from this archaeological lens as builders and organizers, patrons and planners, whose vision materialized in brick and stone as well as in text and thought. Their world, though largely vanished, remains accessible through the fragments they left behind, inviting modern audiences to engage with a civilization that once linked Eastern India to the wider Buddhist world. In concluding this part of the series, the archaeological dimension reinforces a central insight of the Pala narrative: that empires are remembered not only through political chronicles, but through the landscapes they shape and the material cultures they create. The Pala Empire lives on in ruined monasteries, scattered sculptures, and the scholarly efforts that seek to understand them, offering a powerful reminder that the physical traces of the past, when carefully studied, can illuminate the deepest currents of human history and belief. Part 7 of the Pala Empire series turns toward a reflective synthesis, weaving together political history, religious transformation, cultural transmission, and human experience to present the Pala world as a living continuum rather than a closed historical chapter. By this stage, the narrative of the Palas has expanded beyond dynastic rise and fall to encompass the rhythms of belief, learning, art, and memory that define their civilization. The Pala Empire existed at a historical crossroads where ancient Indian traditions encountered medieval transformations, and this liminal position gave its culture both resilience and vulnerability. The Palas ruled during a time when political authority was becoming increasingly localized, yet intellectual and spiritual networks were becoming more global. This paradox shaped every aspect of their world, from kingship and administration to monastic life and artistic expression. Pala rulers understood that military strength alone could not guarantee stability in such an environment. Legitimacy had to be continually negotiated through moral authority, religious patronage, and institutional continuity. Their sustained commitment to Buddhism, especially at a time when Hindu devotional movements were gaining momentum, reveals a conscious choice to preserve a tradition they regarded as central to social harmony and cosmic order. This choice shaped not only state ideology, but also the lived experiences of countless individuals who inhabited the Pala realm. For monks and scholars, the Pala period offered an unparalleled environment for intellectual pursuit, where debate was encouraged, texts were scrutinized line by line, and learning was regarded as a sacred act. For artisans and laborers, the construction and maintenance of monasteries and temples provided livelihoods while embedding religious symbolism into everyday work. For merchants and travelers, The empire's openness to transregional exchange created opportunities for movement and interaction that expanded horizons far beyond local boundaries. The Pala Empire thus functioned as a connective tissue, linking diverse social groups through shared participation in a civilizational project centered on knowledge and faith. The religious life of the Pala period was marked by plurality and dialogue rather than rigid exclusivity. Although Buddhist institutions enjoyed royal favor, they coexisted with Hindu temples, Saiva ascetics, and Brahmanical scholars, creating a dynamic religious landscape where ideas circulated freely and competition stimulated innovation. This environment fostered the development of sophisticated philosophical systems and ritual practices, particularly within Vajrayana Buddhism, which sought to integrate meditative insight with symbolic action. The resulting religious culture was deeply experiential, emphasizing both intellectual understanding and transformative practice. Such synthesis helps explain why Pala Buddhism proved so influential abroad, where it could adapt to new contexts while retaining its core principles. The transmission of Pala Buddhist traditions to Tibet and beyond was not a simple act of export, but a process of mutual engagement, in which Indian teachers and foreign students collaborated to reinterpret doctrines for new audiences. This collaborative spirit reflects a broader Pala ethos that valued dialogue, translation, and adaptation as pathways to truth. The gradual decline of the Pala Empire forces us to confront the impermanence that lies at the heart of historical processes. Political authority, no matter how well structured, remains subject to shifting alliances, economic pressures, and cultural change. Yet the Pala experience demonstrates that decline need not entail erasure. As their territorial control diminished, the Pala's cultural influence continued to radiate outward, carried by texts, images, and memories that found refuge in distant lands. This dispersal transformed loss into diffusion, ensuring that the intellectual and spiritual achievements of the Pala period would survive in altered but recognizable forms. The disappearance of Buddhism from much of India after the 12th century has often been framed as a story of displacement. But within the longer arc of history, it can also be seen as a story of migration and renewal, with the Pala Empire serving as a crucial bridge between Indian origins and Asian futures. The human dimension of this transformation should not be overlooked. Behind the abstractions of empire and religion lay individuals who experienced hope, devotion, struggle, and doubt. Students who traveled thousands of miles to study at Nalanda or Vikramashila carried not only manuscripts but aspirations for enlightenment and service. Monks who witnessed the decline of monastic centers faced the pain of witnessing cherished institutions fade, yet many also carried their knowledge forward, becoming agents of continuity in unfamiliar lands. Artisans who sculpted serene Buddhas may never have imagined that their creations would be revered centuries later in distant monasteries, yet their work became vessels of enduring meaning. These human stories remind us that the Pala Empire was not merely a political structure, but a community of lives shaped by shared values and aspirations. From the standpoint of historical interpretation, the Pala Empire challenges modern categories and assumptions. It complicates narratives that equate progress with centralized power or religious dominance with uniform belief. Instead, the Pala case illustrates how diversity, negotiation, and institutional depth can sustain a civilization even amid political fragility. It also underscores the importance of looking beyond national or regional boundaries when assessing historical impact. The Palas may appear peripheral within conventional Indian political history, yet they occupy a central place in the history of Buddhism and Asian intellectual exchange. This duality invites a more nuanced understanding of significance, one that measures influence not only by territorial reach, but by the capacity to shape minds, practices, and cultural memory across generations. In contemporary times, the legacy of the Pala Empire resonates in multiple ways. Scholars continue to study its texts and artifacts, uncovering layers of meaning that speak to enduring philosophical questions about reality, ethics, and liberation. Cultural heritage initiatives seek to preserve Pala sites as reminders of a shared past that transcends modern borders, fostering dialogue between nations connected by this history. For practitioners of Buddhism around the world, the Pala period remains a source of inspiration, representing a moment when scholarship, practice, and state support converged to produce a flourishing spiritual culture. Even for those outside religious traditions, the Pala story offers insights into how societies can balance material needs with intellectual and ethical aspirations. Part 7 of the Pala Empire series thus serves as a meditative culmination, drawing together threads from previous sections to present a vision of history that values continuity over rupture and meaning over mere chronology. It invites readers to reflect on what endures when empires fall and to recognize that the most powerful legacies are often intangible, residing in ideas, practices, and memories that travel across time and space. The Pala Empire, viewed through this lens, emerges not as a vanished kingdom, but as an ongoing conversation between past and present, India and Asia, power and wisdom. In tracing this conversation, we come to appreciate the Palas not only as rulers of a Buddhist empire, but as stewards of a cultural inheritance that continues to shape human understanding. Their story reminds us that while political forms are transient, the pursuit of knowledge, compassion, and truth can confer a different kind of permanence, one that survives the rise and fall of states and continues to illuminate the human journey long after the echoes of imperial authority have faded. Part 8 of the Pala Empire series explores the subtle yet profound transformations in religious psychology, cultural identity, and collective memory that unfolded during and after the Pala period, revealing how an empire can continue to shape consciousness long after its political structures have vanished. By this stage in the narrative, the Palas are no longer viewed merely as historical rulers, but as agents of a deeper civilizational process that influenced how communities understood knowledge, faith, and belonging. The Pala Empire existed at a moment when Buddhism in India was transitioning from a widely practiced social religion to a more scholastic and esoteric tradition, and this shift profoundly affected how religious identity was constructed. Under Pala patronage, Buddhism increasingly emphasized advanced philosophical inquiry, tantric ritual, and monastic discipline, creating a form of religious life that was intellectually demanding and symbolically rich. This orientation strengthened Buddhism's appeal to scholars and spiritual specialists while gradually distancing it from broader popular participation, a development that had lasting implications for its future in India. Yet this very specialization enabled Buddhist thought to achieve extraordinary depth and coherence, ensuring its survival as a sophisticated philosophical system even as its social base narrowed. The Palas, consciously or not, presided over this transformation, shaping a Buddhism that would endure globally even as it receded locally. Cultural identity under the Palas was equally layered and dynamic. The empire's subjects did not experience identity as a single, uniform category, but as an intersection of region, occupation, language, and belief. Bengali, Magadhi, and other local cultural traditions coexisted with Sanskritic learning and pan-Indian religious ideals, creating a rich tapestry of expression. The Palas did not attempt to homogenize these identities. Instead, they governed through accommodation and synthesis, allowing local customs to persist within a broader imperial framework. This flexibility fostered a sense of belonging that was not dependent solely on political loyalty, but on participation in shared cultural and religious practices. Over time, however, as new dynasties promoted more rigid social and religious structures, this pluralistic ethos gave way to sharper boundaries of identity, contributing to the marginalization of Buddhist communities. The memory of the Pala period thus came to represent, in retrospect, an era of openness and intellectual freedom, a contrast that would shape later historical imagination. The post-Pala centuries witnessed a gradual reframing of history itself, as Buddhist institutions declined in India and their narratives were preserved primarily in foreign traditions. Tibetan, Nepalese, and Southeast Asian chronicles remembered the Palas not as declining rulers, but as ideal patrons of authentic Buddhism, guardians of a sacred lineage that connected later practitioners to the Buddha's homeland. This external memory preserved aspects of the Pala world that were forgotten or neglected locally, creating a split historical consciousness in which the same empire was remembered differently across regions. In India, the Palas faded into obscurity within popular memory, overshadowed by Hindu dynasties and later political developments, while in the Buddhist world beyond India, they were revered as champions of learning and faith. This divergence illustrates how history is shaped not only by events, but by the needs and values of those who remember them. The Pala Empire became a symbol through which different communities articulated their own identities, aspirations, and interpretations of the past. Literature and ritual played a crucial role in sustaining the Pala legacy. Texts composed or systematized under Pala patronage continued to circulate, studied and recited in monastic settings far removed from their place of origin. Ritual manuals, philosophical treatises, and narrative works preserved a vision of the world shaped by Pala intellectual culture, reinforcing patterns of thought that emphasized interdependence, impermanence, and compassion. Artistic representations likewise functioned as carriers of memory, with Pala-style images serving as visual anchors for religious identity in new cultural environments. These images did not merely depict deities, they encoded an entire worldview, one in which serenity, balance, and insight were central values. Through such material and textual forms, the Pala Empire lived on as a presence in the everyday religious experience of distant communities. The psychological dimension of the Pala legacy is perhaps its most enduring aspect. By elevating learning, debate, and disciplined practice as paths to liberation, the Palas helped shape a conception of spirituality grounded in self-cultivation and ethical responsibility. This approach resonated deeply with societies that valued education and moral order, contributing to Buddhism's adaptability across cultures. At the same time, the decline of Pala institutions in India left a sense of loss that is discernible in later Buddhist narratives, where the disappearance of great monasteries is lamented as a sign of spiritual decline in the world. Such narratives transformed historical change into moral reflection, reinforcing Buddhist teachings on impermanence while preserving emotional attachment to a vanished golden age. The Pala Empire thus became both an example and a lesson, illustrating the transient nature of worldly achievements and the enduring value of wisdom. From a modern perspective, the Pala story invites reconsideration of how civilizations are evaluated and remembered. Conventional historical frameworks often privilege political dominance and military success, yet the Palas challenge this emphasis by demonstrating how cultural and intellectual influence can outweigh territorial control in long-term significance. Their empire did not reshape maps for centuries, but it reshaped minds across continents. This realization has important implications for contemporary discussions about cultural heritage, identity, and globalization, reminding us that influence flows through education, dialogue, and creativity as much as through power. In an era of rapid change, the Pala example underscores the importance of investing in institutions that cultivate knowledge and ethical reflection, even when their immediate utility is not apparent. Part 8 of the Pala Empire series thus deepens the narrative by tracing the afterlife of an empire in memory, identity, and consciousness. It reveals how the Palas continue to speak to us not through surviving thrones or armies, but through the ideas, images, and values they helped nurture. Their story becomes a mirror in which we can examine our own assumptions about progress, decline, and legacy. By following the subtle currents of remembrance and reinterpretation, we see the Pala Empire not as a closed chapter of ancient history, but as an ongoing influence woven into the cultural and spiritual fabric of Asia. In this sense, the Palas remain present, inviting each generation to rediscover their achievements and to reflect on the deeper meanings of civilization, continuity, and the human search for understanding. Part 9 of the Pala Empire series turns toward the philosophical culmination of the Pala Age, examining how ideas forged under Pala patronage reshaped Buddhist thought, ethical reasoning, and the very understanding of knowledge and reality, leaving an imprint that extended far beyond India and long outlasted the empire itself. By the time of the later Palas, Buddhism in eastern India had reached an extraordinary level of intellectual sophistication, characterized by rigorous debate, refined epistemology, and a deep engagement with the nature of mind, perception, and liberation. The monasteries supported by the Palas were not merely centers of religious devotion, but vibrant intellectual laboratories where scholars sought to reconcile logic with compassion, metaphysics with lived experience, and ritual practice with philosophical insight. This synthesis became one of the defining achievements of the Pala period and a cornerstone of Buddhist philosophy as it developed across Asia. Central to this intellectual culture was the systematic study of pramana, or valid means of knowledge, which occupied a crucial place in late Indian Buddhist thought. Scholars working within the Pala milieu engaged intensely with questions of perception, inference, and language, responding to challenges posed by Brahmanical schools such as Nyaya and Mimamsa. Rather than retreating into dogma, Buddhist philosophers refined their arguments, developing sophisticated theories of cognition that emphasized momentariness, dependent origination, and the constructed nature of conceptual knowledge. These debates were not abstract exercises divorced from spiritual concerns. They were seen as essential to clearing the mind of ignorance and false views, thereby supporting the path to liberation. The integration of logic and soteriology under the Palas demonstrates a distinctive vision of knowledge as ethically charged and spiritually transformative, a vision that profoundly influenced later Buddhist traditions, especially in Tibet. Alongside epistemology, the philosophy of emptiness, or shunyata, reached new levels of subtlety during the Pala period. Building on earlier Madhyamaka traditions, Pala-era scholars explored the implications of emptiness not as nihilism, but as a middle way that avoided both absolutism and denial. Emptiness was understood as a dynamic principle that revealed the interdependent nature of all phenomena, fostering compassion by dissolving rigid distinctions between self and other. This philosophical orientation resonated deeply with the Pala's broader cultural ethos, which emphasized interconnectedness at social, political, and spiritual levels. The empire itself, with its network of monasteries, trade routes, and scholarly exchanges, can be seen as a material expression of this interdependence, reflecting philosophical ideals in lived reality. The rise of Vajrayana Buddhism under the Palas added another layer to this intellectual landscape, blending philosophical rigor with symbolic ritual and meditative practice. Tantric texts and teachings emphasize the transformation of ordinary experience into a path to enlightenment, using visualization, mantra, and ritual gesture to integrate body, speech, and mind. Far from rejecting philosophical inquiry, Vajrayana under the Palas incorporated it, insisting that ritual practice must be grounded in correct understanding. This insistence ensured that Tantric Buddhism did not devolve into mere esotericism, but remained anchored in ethical discipline and doctrinal clarity. The resulting synthesis proved remarkably adaptable, enabling Buddhist traditions influenced by the Palas to flourish in diverse cultural contexts while maintaining a coherent philosophical core. The ethical dimension of Pala Buddhist thought also deserves special attention, as it reveals how philosophy translated into ideals of conduct and governance. Compassion, generosity, and nonviolence were not only personal virtues, but guiding principles for rulers and institutions. Pala kings portrayed themselves as bodhisattva-like figures, committed to the welfare of their subjects and the protection of learning. While political realities often fell short of these ideals, the aspiration itself shaped expectations of kingship and provided a moral framework within which power was exercised and judged. This ethical vision influenced later Buddhist political thought in Tibet and Southeast Asia, where rulers similarly adopted the language and symbolism of bodhisattva kingship to legitimize authority. The decline of the Pala Empire did not halt the dissemination of these philosophical and ethical ideas. On the contrary, it accelerated their movement beyond India. As monasteries weakened and political support waned, scholars and texts migrated to regions where Buddhism continued to receive patronage. In Tibet, Pala-influenced philosophies became foundational, shaping curricula, monastic discipline, and methods of debate that persist to this day. Tibetan scholasticism preserved not only the content of Pala thought, but also its style, emphasizing rigorous analysis, structured debate, and the integration of theory and practice. Through this transmission, the Pala intellectual legacy achieved a form of continuity that transcended geographic and temporal boundaries. The philosophical achievements of the Pala period also invite reflection on the nature of intellectual flourishing itself. The conditions that enabled such depth of thought included institutional stability, patronage that valued scholarship, and a culture that encouraged debate across religious and philosophical lines. The Palas did not impose uniformity of thought. Instead, they created spaces in which disagreement could be explored productively. This openness fostered creativity and resilience, allowing Buddhist philosophy to respond dynamically to criticism and change. The eventual loss of these institutional supports in India underscores how fragile intellectual ecosystems can be. Yet the survival of Pala ideas abroad demonstrates that once ideas take root, they can endure even when their original environments disappear. From a modern standpoint, the Pala philosophical legacy offers insights into the relationship between knowledge, ethics, and society. In an age often marked by fragmentation and specialization, the Pala example reminds us of the value of integrative thinking that connects logic with compassion and intellectual rigor with moral responsibility. Their vision of education as a path to personal transformation and social harmony challenges contemporary assumptions about learning as merely instrumental. The Palas invested in scholarship not because it guaranteed immediate political advantage, but because they believed it cultivated wisdom, stability, and ethical order. This belief, though rooted in a specific historical context, speaks to universal questions about the purpose of knowledge and the responsibilities of those who wield it. Part 9 of the Pala Empire series thus highlights the empire's greatest and most enduring contribution, a philosophical tradition that reshaped Buddhism and influenced the intellectual history of Asia. It reveals how ideas nurtured within a particular political and cultural framework can transcend that framework, traveling across borders and centuries to inspire new communities and new forms of thought. In tracing this philosophical arc, we see the Pala Empire not as a relic of the past, but as a continuing presence in the global history of ideas. Their scholars, questions about perception, reality, compassion, and liberation remain relevant, inviting ongoing dialogue between past and present. The Palas remind us that while empires rise and fall, the search for understanding endures, carried forward by minds shaped in moments of extraordinary cultural convergence. Through their commitment to philosophy, ethics, and intellectual exchange, the Palas ensured that their legacy would not be confined to ruins and inscriptions, but would live on in the evolving traditions of human thought. Part 10 of the Pala Empire series serves as the concluding synthesis, drawing together history, philosophy, society, memory, and meaning to present the Pala Empire as a complete civilizational phenomenon whose significance lies not only in what it achieved, but in how it reshaped the trajectory of Asian history. At this final stage, the Palas can be understood as an empire whose deepest power resided in continuity rather than conquest, in institutions rather than individuals, and in ideas rather than borders. Emerging from a period of political fragmentation, the Pala state succeeded in creating a long-lasting structure that balanced regional diversity with imperial coherence, allowing it to endure for nearly 4 centuries in a volatile historical landscape. This durability was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate choices that privileged learning, ethical legitimacy, and cultural exchange over relentless expansion. The Palas recognized that true authority in a complex society required more than military dominance, and they invested accordingly in monasteries, universities, and networks of scholarship that could sustain social order and moral purpose even when political power weakened. This vision of rulership stands as one of the most distinctive features of the Pala experience, setting it apart from many contemporaneous empires whose legacies were more narrowly political or territorial. Across the series, the Pala Empire has emerged as a bridge between worlds, between ancient and medieval India, between local traditions and transregional networks, and between the material and the spiritual dimensions of human life. The empire's geographic position in eastern India placed it at the crossroads of riverine trade, Himalayan routes, and maritime connections, enabling it to function as a conduit for goods, people, and ideas. Yet geography alone does not explain the Pala's influence. What transformed movement into meaning was the institutional framework they nurtured, particularly the great monastic universities that served as engines of cultural transmission. Nalanda, Vikramashila, Samapura, Odintapuri, and other centers were not isolated enclaves, but integrated components of imperial society, linked to agriculture, trade, administration, and diplomacy. Through these institutions, the Palas shaped an intellectual ecology in which knowledge was preserved, contested, and disseminated across generations. The fall of these centers marked a profound rupture in Indian history, yet their ideas survived because they had already taken root elsewhere, illustrating how the Palas succeeded in exporting not merely texts, but systems of thought and practice. The religious significance of the Pala Empire cannot be overstated, for it represented the final great flowering of Buddhism in its land of origin. At a time when devotional Hindu movements were gaining momentum and reshaping religious life across India, the Palas remained steadfast patrons of Buddhism, particularly in its Mahayana and Vajrayana forms. This commitment shaped the character of late Indian Buddhism, emphasizing scholastic rigor, ethical discipline, and symbolic ritual. While this orientation may have narrowed Buddhism's popular base within India, it simultaneously strengthened its intellectual foundations, enabling it to flourish in Tibet, Nepal, and Southeast Asia. The Palas thus occupy a paradoxical position in religious history. They presided over Buddhism's decline as a mass religion in India, while ensuring its survival as a global philosophical and spiritual tradition. This paradox invites reflection on the complex relationship between social change and cultural preservation, reminding us that continuity often takes unexpected forms. Socially and economically, the Pala Empire left enduring marks on eastern India through its agrarian systems, land grants, and urban networks. The patterns of landholding and institutional patronage established under the Palas shaped regional societies long after the dynasty's fall, influencing successor states and contributing to the emergence of new political orders. The rise of the Senas did not erase the Pala past, but built upon its foundations, adapting inherited structures to new ideological priorities. This continuity underscores the Palas' role as architects of a regional order that transcended dynastic boundaries. At the level of everyday life, the Pala period fostered a society in which religious institutions, artisans, merchants, and peasants were interconnected, each contributing to the functioning of an empire whose identity was inseparable from its cultural practices. The material remains of this society, from monumental monasteries to finely crafted sculptures, testify to a shared investment in meaning and beauty that went beyond utilitarian concerns. In terms of historical memory, the Pala Empire exemplifies how civilizations are remembered differently across space and time. Within India, the Palas gradually receded from popular consciousness, their Buddhist identity rendering them less central to later narratives shaped by Hindu and Islamic polities. Beyond India, however, especially in the Tibetan and Himalayan worlds, the Palas were remembered with reverence as ideal patrons of authentic Buddhism. This divergence in memory reveals the selective nature of history and the ways in which communities construct the past to serve present needs. The rediscovery of Pala sites and texts in the modern era has begun to bridge this gap, allowing contemporary scholarship to reinsert the Palas into broader narratives of Indian and world history. Archaeology, art history, and comparative philosophy have collectively restored the Pala Empire to its rightful place as a major force in medieval civilization. From a philosophical perspective, the ultimate legacy of the Palas lies in their integration of knowledge, ethics, and power. They demonstrated that an empire could define itself not solely through domination, but through stewardship of wisdom and moral values. Their support for debate, translation, and intellectual exchange created a culture in which disagreement was not a threat, but a source of insight. This openness proved crucial to Buddhism's adaptability and resilience, enabling it to engage critically with rival traditions and to evolve in response to new contexts. The Pala example challenges modern assumptions about decline and success, suggesting that the true measure of a civilization lies in the depth of its contributions to human understanding rather than the permanence of its political structures. Part 10 thus completes the Pala Empire series by returning to its central theme: impermanence transformed into continuity through culture. The Palas accepted, consciously or intuitively, the Buddhist insight that all compounded things must pass, yet they acted as if ideas, values, and institutions could be cultivated to outlast their own moment. In doing so, they succeeded beyond measure. The empire they built eventually vanished from the political map, but the civilization they nurtured continued to shape minds, rituals, and artistic traditions across Asia for centuries. The Pala Empire stands as a testament to the power of learning, compassion, and cultural exchange to transcend the limits of time and territory. In closing this series, the story of the Palas invites us to reconsider what it means to build something lasting. Their legacy teaches that while empires fall, civilizations endure through the ideas they generate and the lives they inspire. The Palas, as guardians of knowledge and faith, ensured that their influence would not end with their last ruler, but would continue as a living presence in the intellectual and spiritual history of humanity. Part 11 of the Pala Empire series moves beyond conventional chronology to explore the afterlife of the Pala world, examining how its intellectual, artistic, and spiritual currents continued to flow long after the political structure had dissolved, shaping regions far removed from Bengal and Bihar, and influencing centuries of Asian history in subtle yet profound ways. When the last Pala rulers faded into obscurity and new dynasties claimed the fertile plains of eastern India, the disappearance of imperial authority did not signify the end of the Pala civilizational project. Instead, it marked a transformation in which ideas outlived institutions and memory replaced administration as the primary vehicle of influence. The monastic universities that once functioned under royal patronage suffered destruction or decline, particularly in the face of political upheavals and changing religious demographics. Yet the scholars trained within those walls had already carried Pala Buddhism across the Himalayan corridors into Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, and beyond, where it took root in new cultural soils. In Tibet especially, the Pala legacy became foundational, as Indian masters educated in the Pala scholastic tradition were invited by Tibetan kings to transmit authentic teachings, ritual systems, and philosophical lineages. Figures associated with the late Pala intellectual environment, directly or indirectly, shaped the formation of Tibetan Buddhism, ensuring that Pala-era interpretations of Madhyamaka, Yogacara, and Vajrayana ritual became canonical far from their place of origin. Tibetan monasteries preserved Sanskrit texts that were lost in India, turning the plateau into an unintended archive of the Pala intellectual universe, a phenomenon that highlights how cultural survival often depends on displacement rather than stability. In Southeast Asia, echoes of Pala art and architecture can be traced in sculptural styles and religious iconography, revealing a shared visual language that crossed oceans through trade and pilgrimage networks. The distinctive smoothness, balanced proportions, and meditative calm of Pala sculpture influenced representations of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas in regions as distant as Java and Cambodia, demonstrating how aesthetics can function as a silent but enduring form of communication between civilizations. These artistic transmissions were not mere imitations, but adaptations, as local traditions absorbed Pala elements into their own symbolic frameworks, producing hybrid forms that testify to the flexibility and universal appeal of the Pala artistic vision. Within India itself, the memory of the Palas became layered and complex, shaped by later historical narratives that prioritized different dynasties and religious identities. While the Senas emphasized Brahmanical revival and gradually marginalized Buddhist institutions, they nonetheless inherited a landscape shaped by Pala land grants, urban centers, and administrative practices, revealing a continuity that persisted beneath ideological change. Over time, as Buddhism declined as an organized religion in the region, the Palas were remembered less as Buddhist emperors and more as distant rulers of a golden age, their achievements partially obscured by the shifting priorities of medieval historiography. It was only in the modern period, through archaeology and critical scholarship, that the full scope of the Pala Empire began to reemerge, challenging earlier assumptions about the nature of Indian medieval history and the supposed abrupt disappearance of Buddhism from the subcontinent. Excavations at Samapura Mahavihara and renewed studies of Nalanda transformed ruins into narratives, allowing historians to reconstruct the daily life, intellectual vibrancy, and cosmopolitan character of Pala institutions. These discoveries reframed the Palas not as a peripheral dynasty, but as central actors in a Trans-Asian story of knowledge exchange, positioning Eastern India as a major hub of global history long before the modern era. From a comparative perspective, the Pala Empire offers a unique case study in how empires can exercise soft power through culture rather than coercion, influencing distant societies without imposing direct political control. Unlike empires that expanded through conquest and colonization, the Palas extended their reach through pilgrimage, pedagogy, and patronage, relying on the attractiveness of their intellectual and spiritual traditions to draw others into their sphere. This model of influence challenges modern definitions of imperialism and invites a broader understanding of how civilizations interact, compete, and cooperate. The Pala experience demonstrates that cultural confidence, when combined with institutional support, can produce a legacy more resilient than military might. Philosophically, the continued relevance of Pala Buddhism lies in its emphasis on synthesis, bringing together logic, ethics, ritual, and meditation into a coherent system aimed at both personal liberation and social harmony. The scholastic rigor cultivated under the Palas encouraged critical inquiry, while remaining grounded in compassion, a balance that allowed Buddhist thought to engage productively with rival traditions rather than retreat into dogmatism. This intellectual openness is one reason why Pala-era Buddhism proved adaptable to new cultural contexts, capable of responding to local needs without losing its core principles. In a world increasingly marked by ideological polarization, the Pala commitment to dialogue and learning offers a historical example of how pluralism can be institutionalized rather than merely tolerated. The environmental and geographic dimension of the Pala legacy also deserves attention, as the empire's integration with river systems, monsoon cycles, and agrarian rhythms shaped patterns of settlement and resource management that influenced the region for centuries. The monasteries were not isolated spiritual retreats, but active participants in the economic life of the countryside, managing land, supporting artisans, and providing stability in times of uncertainty. This integration of spiritual and material concerns reflects a holistic worldview in which ethical responsibility extended to the management of natural and social resources. Even after the decline of monastic power, these patterns left imprints on rural organization and local economies, further embedding the Pala influence into the fabric of everyday life. Part 11 thus presents the Pala Empire not as a closed historical chapter, but as an ongoing presence, a set of ideas and practices that continued to evolve as they moved through time and space. The Palas remind us that history does not end with political collapse. It disperses, transforms, and resurfaces in unexpected places. Their story encourages a rethinking of legacy itself, suggesting that the most enduring contributions of a civilization may be those that escape direct control and take on lives of their own. In tracing the Pala afterlife across regions and centuries, this part underscores the empire's role as a catalyst rather than a container, setting forces in motion that could not be confined within its original boundaries. The Pala Empire, viewed from this long perspective, emerges as a civilizational seed whose growth extended far beyond the soil in which it was planted. Through texts preserved in foreign monasteries, images carved in distant lands, and philosophies debated in languages yet unborn, the Palas continue to speak across time, inviting modern readers to recognize the quiet power of knowledge, faith, and cultural generosity in shaping the human story. Part 12 of the Pala Empire series turns inward to examine the inner mechanics of civilization itself as revealed through the Pala experience, focusing on governance, ideology, daily life, and the subtle ways in which power, belief, and society interacted to create a uniquely resilient Buddhist empire in early medieval India. By this stage, the Palas can no longer be understood merely as a sequence of rulers or events. Instead, they emerge as a living system in which monarchy, monasticism, economy, and culture were deeply interwoven, each sustaining and reshaping the other. The Pala state operated through a careful balance of central authority and regional autonomy, recognizing the diversity of eastern India and adapting governance accordingly. Kings exercised sovereignty through land grants, military oversight, and symbolic patronage rather than intrusive administration, allowing local elites, monasteries, and village institutions to manage everyday affairs. This approach reduced resistance and fostered loyalty, particularly among religious communities who saw the Pala ruler not simply as a tax collector or warlord, but as a dharmic guardian responsible for maintaining cosmic and social order. The frequent use of titles emphasizing moral kingship and religious merit reveals how legitimacy was framed in ethical and spiritual terms, reflecting a worldview in which political success was inseparable from moral conduct. At the heart of Pala ideology lay Buddhism, yet it was a Buddhism that coexisted with and adapted to a pluralistic environment. While the Palas were devoted patrons of Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions, they did not enforce religious uniformity across their territories. Brahmanical temples, local cults, and emerging devotional movements continued to function, creating a complex religious landscape in which competition and coexistence unfolded simultaneously. This tolerance was not merely pragmatic but philosophical, rooted in Buddhist principles that emphasized compassion and understanding over coercion. As a result, the Pala realm became a space where intellectual debate flourished, with scholars engaging across doctrinal boundaries in monasteries, courts, and urban centers. These debates were not abstract exercises. They shaped educational curricula, ritual practices, and even artistic expression, contributing to a dynamic cultural environment that encouraged innovation while respecting tradition. Daily life under the Palas reflected this synthesis of stability and creativity. Rural society revolved around agriculture, supported by river systems and monsoon cycles that sustained rice cultivation and trade in surplus grain. Villages were connected to monasteries and towns through networks of exchange, with peasants supplying food and labor in return for protection, ritual services, and access to markets. Artisans produced textiles, metalwork, and sculptures that served both religious and secular needs, their skills refined through patronage from monasteries and elites alike. Urban centers, though fewer than in earlier periods, functioned as hubs of commerce and learning, attracting merchants from distant regions and students from across Asia. In these towns, languages, scripts, and customs mingled, reflecting the cosmopolitan character of the Pala world. Education was perhaps the most distinctive feature of Pala society, shaping not only monks but the broader cultural ethos. The great universities operated as complex institutions with hierarchies, curricula, and evaluation systems that rivaled any contemporary center of learning. Students engaged in years of study, mastering logic, grammar, medicine, metaphysics, and ritual alongside meditation and ethical training. This holistic education produced individuals capable of serving as teachers, diplomats, healers, and advisors, extending the influence of Pala culture far beyond monastery walls. The emphasis on debate and critical inquiry fostered intellectual resilience, enabling Buddhist thought to respond to challenges from rival philosophies and changing social realities. This educational culture also contributed to the preservation and transmission of knowledge, ensuring that texts were copied, commented upon, and carried to new regions even as conditions within India became less favorable. The artistic achievements of the Pala period offer another window into the empire's inner life, revealing how spiritual ideals were translated into visual form. Sculpture and architecture were not decorative luxuries, but integral components of religious practice, designed to guide meditation and embody philosophical concepts. The serene expressions and balanced proportions of Pala figures reflect an aesthetic of inner harmony, suggesting a society deeply invested in cultivating mental and emotional equilibrium. These works were accessible to diverse audiences, from monks engaged in advanced ritual visualization to lay devotees seeking inspiration and merit. Through art, complex ideas were rendered tangible, allowing abstract principles to shape everyday religious experience. As the series progresses toward its later parts, the question of decline inevitably arises, yet Part 12 reframes decline as transformation rather than failure. The weakening of central authority, the rise of new dynasties, and the gradual erosion of Buddhist institutions did not erase the structures the Palas had built. Instead, these structures were repurposed, adapted, or absorbed into new cultural formations. Land grants continued to shape agrarian relations, artistic styles persisted in modified forms, and educational ideals influenced later scholastic traditions. Even the memory of the Palas, though fragmented, contributed to regional identities and historical consciousness. This perspective challenges linear narratives of rise and fall, emphasizing continuity and adaptation as fundamental aspects of historical change. The Pala Empire thus becomes a case study in how civilizations endure not through static preservation, but through dynamic interaction with shifting circumstances. On a broader level, the Pala experience invites reflection on the nature of power itself. By grounding authority in ethical responsibility and intellectual patronage, the Palas demonstrated an alternative model of empire that prioritized meaning over mere dominance. Their rulers sought merit as well as obedience, investing in institutions that nurtured wisdom and compassion. While this model did not guarantee perpetual political success, it produced a legacy of ideas and practices that proved remarkably durable. In an age often defined by conflict and conquest, the Pala example stands as a reminder that civilizations can achieve greatness through cultivation rather than coercion. Part 12, therefore, deepens the series by illuminating the lived reality of the Pala world, revealing how its ideals were enacted in governance, economy, education, and art. It shows that the strength of the Pala Empire lay not solely in its armies or territories, but in its capacity to align political structures with cultural and spiritual values. This alignment created a society capable of generating knowledge, beauty, and ethical reflection on a scale that resonated far beyond its borders. As the series continues, this understanding prepares the ground for exploring how the Pala legacy speaks to modern concerns, offering insights into sustainability, pluralism, and the enduring power of ideas. Part 13 of the Pala Empire series extends the narrative into the realm of long-term historical interpretation, examining how the Pala experience reshapes our understanding of Indian civilization, Buddhist history, and the broader patterns of human development when viewed through the lens of continuity, adaptation, and intellectual resilience. By this stage, the Pala Empire stands not merely as a regional power of early medieval Eastern India, but as a civilizational axis around which multiple historical trajectories converged, including the evolution of Buddhist philosophy, the transformation of statecraft, and the integration of culture across Asia. One of the most striking lessons of the Pala period is the manner in which political authority was consciously aligned with intellectual and spiritual legitimacy, creating a form of governance that sought endurance through meaning rather than intimidation. Unlike empires that relied on rapid expansion or centralized coercion, the Palas cultivated stability by embedding themselves within the ethical frameworks of Buddhism and the practical realities of agrarian society, thereby fostering a political culture that could absorb shocks and persist across generations. This approach explains why the Pala polity survived internal rivalries, external invasions, and economic fluctuations for nearly 4 centuries in a region historically prone to fragmentation. The Pala conception of kingship emphasized responsibility over absolutism, portraying the ruler as a protector of dharma, whose success depended on moral conduct as much as military strength. This ideology resonated deeply with monastic communities and local elites, creating a shared sense of purpose that bound disparate social groups into a relatively cohesive order. The resulting political ecosystem allowed monasteries, villages, and urban centers to function as semi-autonomous units connected by mutual obligations rather than rigid control, a structure that proved remarkably adaptable. From a civilizational perspective, the Pala Empire represents the final great synthesis of Indian Buddhism before its decline in the subcontinent, preserving and refining traditions that had developed over a millennium while simultaneously preparing them for transmission beyond India's borders. The scholastic environment fostered under the Palas was characterized by extraordinary intellectual rigor, with systematic debate, commentary, and synthesis forming the backbone of monastic education. This culture of disciplined inquiry ensured that Buddhist philosophy remained dynamic rather than static, capable of responding to critiques from emerging Hindu schools and internal doctrinal tensions alike. The emphasis on logic, epistemology, and metaphysics during the Pala era shaped the form Buddhism would take in Tibet and the Himalayan regions, where these intellectual traditions became central to religious practice and identity. In this sense, the decline of Buddhism in India did not represent an end but a redirection, with the Pala Empire acting as the final channel through which Indian Buddhist thought flowed outward to the wider world. The artistic legacy of the Palas further reinforces their civilizational importance, offering visual evidence of a worldview that prized balance, introspection, and transcendence. Pala art was not merely a reflection of elite taste, but a medium through which philosophical concepts were made accessible to diverse audiences. The calm expressions and harmonious proportions of Buddhist images embodied ideals of inner equilibrium, serving as tools for meditation and ethical reflection. These aesthetic principles traveled alongside religious teachings, influencing artistic traditions across Asia and shaping the visual language of Buddhism in regions far removed from the Ganges plain. Such transmission underscores the role of art as a carrier of values, capable of communicating complex ideas across linguistic and cultural boundaries. Economically and socially, the Pala Empire illustrates how spiritual institutions can function as engines of material organization without undermining ethical commitments. Monasteries acted as centers of redistribution, education, and stability, integrating religious life with agricultural production and trade. This integration challenges modern assumptions that spirituality and economic rationality exist in opposition, demonstrating instead how moral frameworks can guide resource management and social welfare. The land grant system, often criticized for fragmenting political authority, in fact enabled localized resilience by anchoring economic life in institutions that commanded respect and continuity. Even after the decline of Pala rule, these patterns persisted, shaping regional societies and influencing successor states. The Palas thus contributed to a form of social sustainability that outlasted their political dominance, reinforcing the idea that institutions rooted in shared values can endure beyond the regimes that create them. In historiographical terms, Part 13 highlights the importance of recentering the Pala Empire within global history, moving beyond narratives that privilege conquest-driven empires or linear models of progress. The Pala experience complicates simplistic dichotomies between rise and fall, showing how influence can expand even as political control contracts. Their story invites historians to pay closer attention to intellectual networks, cultural exchange, and institutional continuity as drivers of historical change. By doing so, it becomes possible to recognize the Palas as key contributors to a trans-Asian world system long before the modern era, one in which ideas traveled more freely than armies and knowledge proved more durable than territory. The rediscovery of Pala sites and texts in the modern period has reinforced this perspective, revealing the depth and sophistication of a civilization once marginalized in mainstream narratives. Archaeological remains, manuscript studies, and comparative philosophy have collectively restored the Palas to their rightful place as architects of a major cultural epoch. This reassessment carries implications beyond academic history, challenging contemporary societies to reconsider the metrics by which success and legacy are judged. The Pala Empire suggests that civilizations achieve lasting significance not through domination alone, but through their capacity to nurture wisdom, foster dialogue, and inspire future generations. As Part 13 draws the series toward its final reflections, it becomes clear that the true achievement of the Palas lies in their demonstration of how power can be exercised responsibly within a pluralistic and intellectually vibrant society. Their world was not free from conflict or contradiction, yet it produced structures capable of transforming impermanence into continuity. By investing in education, art, and ethical governance, the Palas ensured that their influence would persist long after their banners fell. In this sense, the Pala Empire stands as a quiet counterpoint to more militarized models of history, reminding us that the deepest currents of human civilization often flow beneath the surface of political events. The legacy of the Palas endures not as a relic of the past, but as an ongoing invitation to imagine forms of social organization grounded in learning, compassion, and cultural generosity. Through this lens, the Pala Empire emerges not merely as a chapter in Indian history, but as a lasting contribution to the shared heritage of humanity, one whose lessons remain relevant wherever societies seek to balance power with purpose and continuity with change. Part 14 of the Pala Empire series turns toward a reflective horizon, exploring the philosophical, civilizational, and global implications of the Pala experience while situating it within the deeper rhythms of world history, where ideas outlast states and cultural memory reshapes the meaning of power across centuries. At this stage, the Pala Empire is best understood not as a closed medieval polity, but as a historical laboratory in which alternative possibilities of governance, spirituality, and knowledge production were tested with remarkable consistency. The Palas emerged in an age of transition, when the classical order of ancient India was giving way to new regional formations, devotional movements, and evolving economic systems. Rather than resisting change through rigid centralization, the Pala rulers adapted to this fluid environment by cultivating institutions that could survive political instability, especially monasteries, universities, and networks of scholarship. This strategic emphasis on intellectual infrastructure reveals a sophisticated understanding of time, one in which rulers accepted impermanence at the level of dynasties while striving for continuity at the level of civilization. Such an approach reflects a deeply Buddhist sensibility, aligning political practice with philosophical insight in a manner rarely achieved at imperial scale. The Pala commitment to learning was not abstract idealism, but a concrete investment in human capital, as monks, scholars, artists, and administrators were trained to preserve, interpret, and transmit knowledge. This investment transformed Eastern India into a gravitational center of Buddhist thought at a moment when the religion was under increasing pressure within its homeland. By consolidating scholastic traditions and encouraging rigorous debate, the Palas ensured that Buddhism would leave India not as a fragmented relic, but as a mature, systematized intellectual tradition capable of flourishing elsewhere. The resulting transmission to Tibet and the Himalayan world represents one of the most significant cultural migrations in history, comparable in impact to the spread of Greek philosophy into the Islamic world or Roman law into medieval Europe. In each case, ideas survived political collapse by finding new institutional homes, and the Pala Empire played precisely this catalytic role for late Indian Buddhism. From a global perspective, the Palas challenge modern assumptions about what constitutes historical influence. Their power did not manifest primarily through conquest or colonization, but through attraction, credibility, and ethical authority. Students traveled thousands of kilometers to study in Pala-supported institutions, not because they were coerced, but because these centers represented the highest standards of learning available in their world. This form of influence, often described as soft power in modern terms, was rooted in cultural confidence rather than strategic manipulation. The Palas did not seek to impose their worldview. They created conditions in which it could persuade through depth and coherence. This model of civilizational interaction stands in contrast to more violent modes of expansion and invites a reevaluation of how history measures success. The endurance of Pala ideas in distant regions suggests that legitimacy grounded in knowledge and ethics may prove more sustainable than authority grounded solely in force. Within India, the long-term consequences of the Pala period were equally profound, even if less immediately visible. The structures they established shaped regional identities, economic patterns, and artistic traditions that persisted through subsequent dynasties. The Sena rulers, often portrayed as ideological opponents due to their Brahmanical orientation, nonetheless inherited and repurposed a landscape molded by Pala institutions. Roads, towns, landholding systems, and artistic workshops did not disappear with the fall of Buddhist patronage. They were absorbed into new frameworks, demonstrating how civilizations layer themselves over time rather than replacing one another entirely. This process of layering complicates simplistic narratives of religious decline, revealing instead a gradual transformation in which elements of the Pala world were reinterpreted rather than erased. Even devotional Hinduism in eastern India bore traces of Pala aesthetics and institutional practices, suggesting a subtle continuity beneath doctrinal change. Philosophically, the Pala Empire offers a meditation on the relationship between impermanence and responsibility. Buddhist thought emphasizes the transient nature of all conditioned phenomena, yet Pala rulers acted with a sense of long-term obligation that extended beyond their own lifetimes. This apparent tension was resolved through the concept of merit, understood not merely as personal salvation, but as the collective benefit generated by supporting institutions of learning and compassion. By framing political action as an ethical practice with consequences across time, the Palas infused governance with moral depth. This perspective contrasts sharply with modern utilitarian approaches to power, which often prioritize immediate outcomes over enduring values. The Pala example suggests that acknowledging impermanence need not lead to nihilism or short-term thinking. Instead, it can inspire a deeper commitment to creating conditions in which wisdom and empathy can endure even as specific structures fade. The material culture of the Pala period further reinforces this philosophical orientation. Architecture, sculpture, and manuscript production were designed not for ostentation, but for contemplation, balance, and transmission. The monasteries were functional spaces that facilitated learning and community life, while sculptures served as aids to meditation rather than displays of royal vanity. This restraint reflects a cultural ethos in which art was integrated into daily practice rather than isolated as a symbol of power. The widespread influence of Pala artistic forms across Asia demonstrates how such an ethos resonated beyond its original context, offering visual expressions of calm and introspection that transcended linguistic and cultural barriers. In this sense, Pala art functioned as a form of silent philosophy, communicating values without the need for explanation. As modern scholarship continues to uncover and reinterpret the Pala past, new dimensions of their significance continue to emerge. Manuscripts preserved in Tibetan monasteries, archaeological discoveries in Bengal and Bihar, and comparative studies of Asian intellectual history have all contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the Palas as central actors in a global story of knowledge circulation. This ongoing rediscovery highlights the provisional nature of historical narratives and the importance of remaining open to revision as new evidence comes to light. The marginalization of the Palas in earlier historiography reflects not their lack of importance, but the biases of later periods, which privileged certain religious and political traditions over others. Correcting this imbalance is not merely an academic exercise. It reshapes our understanding of India's place in world history and challenges assumptions about cultural continuity and decline. Part 14 thus frames the Pala Empire as a mirror through which modern societies can examine their own priorities. In an era marked by rapid change, ideological conflict, and uncertainty about the future, the Pala experience offers an alternative vision of resilience grounded in education, ethical governance, and cultural exchange. Their story suggests that investing in institutions that cultivate critical thinking and compassion can generate forms of continuity that outlast political regimes and economic cycles. The Palas did not control the future, yet they shaped it by empowering others to think, learn, and adapt. This capacity to influence without dominating constitutes their most enduring achievement. As the series approaches its final movement, the Pala Empire emerges not simply as a subject of historical study, but as a source of insight into the human condition itself. Their legacy reminds us that civilizations are not measured solely by their territorial reach or military victories, but by the depth of their contributions to collective understanding. Through their patronage of learning, tolerance of diversity, and commitment to ethical rule, the Palas demonstrated that power can be exercised as stewardship rather than exploitation. In doing so, they left behind a civilizational imprint that continues to resonate wherever knowledge is valued, dialogue is pursued, and the impermanent is shaped into something enduring.